Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where we gently drift into the oldest corners of mythology and let the forgotten dreams of ancient storytellers lull us into rest tonight. We are not following the bold footsteps of heroes or the loud quarrels of gods, but instead, we are tracing the quieter shadows, the soft echoes of the things even gods feared to name aloud. Tonight you will walk beside creations not born from nature or love, but from divine ambition and cosmic uncertainty machines that never slept, beasts that should not have lived, men who rose from the soil with no past and no future, each one crafted by the will of gods, and yet each one regarded with dread. As you close your eyes and let your breath settle, imagine yourself resting beneath a starlit sky on the edge of the ancient Aegean. The air is warm and still, the scent of olive trees hangs around you, and in the distance across calm water, the island of Crete glows faintly in moonlight. It is here that something metal moves, something built, not born, a hollow clang of bronze echoing through the quiet. This is the story of Talos, the great sentinel, the bronze man who marched endlessly around the island. His task was simple: to protect, to patrol, to endure. But behind his creation was a fear, the fear of losing control, a fear of giving something life without knowing how to stop it. And later, we will journey into the strange tale of the Chimera, a creature made of parts that do not belong together, a lion, egged out, a serpent, all fused into a single being, its breath hot with destruction, its form rejected by nature. Even the gods dared not come near it, for what does it mean when the divine imagination gives shape to something that defies its own order? And finally, as the night grows deeper and your thoughts drift slower, we will unravel the mystery of the Spartoi, the warriors born not of wombs, but of earth, sown like seeds by a hero, and risen in armor, without childhood, without memory, created to fight and to die, and never to question why they lived at all. These are the quieter myths, the ones that do not shout, they hum low with unease. They whisper in temple shadows. They remind us that creation is never without consequence, even for those who never die, and they offer us something to ponder in the slow rhythm of sleep. So get comfortable and let yourself float gently backward into time, into stories that flicker like torchlight against stone, into myths that were never meant to comfort, but that now carry us gently into rest. And now we begin with the first of our sleepy tales, the story of Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete, whose heavy steps still echo through the silence of forgotten ages. Let us begin. Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete, in the vast quiet of the ancient Aegean. See, there lies an island kissed by gentle waves and caressed by soft winds, where the sun spills golden light across hills and valleys that have witnessed the footsteps of gods and men alike. This island is Crete, a place where earth and myth entwine, where olive groves scent the air with their delicate perfume, and the sea whispers secrets to the rugged shore. Here beneath skies that shift slowly from dawn, as tender pink to dusk, as fading purple, a guardian unlike any other roams the rocky coastline. He is not born of flesh and blood, but fashioned from gleaming bronze, a sentinel whose footsteps echo with the steady rhythm of the passing time. His name is Talos, and his body shines like burnished gold. His eyes glow faintly like embers deep within the metal. Each day he walks the island's edge, 3 times tracing an endless circuit, his movements slow, deliberate, and unyielding. No one knows for certain who shaped Talos. Some say Hephaestus, the god of fire and forge, breathed life into molten bronze. Others whisper that Daedalus, the cunning mortal inventor, wrought him from the fires of creativity. Whichever is true, Talos is more than mere metal. He is a living guardian bound by magic and divine will. His creation was a marvel, a testament to skill and power, the veins beneath. His bronze skin carried ichor, the divine blood flowing through a single sealed channel from neck to ankle. This precious life force was his strength and his weakness, for if that vein were ever broken, the sentinel would falter and fall silent forever. Talos' mission was clear and constant: to protect the island from all who might bring harm. His footsteps stirred dust on ancient paths, his gaze sharp and unblinking scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Ships approaching the island found their way barred by his towering presence. Stones hurled by his mighty arms crushed wood and sail. If foes pressed closer, the air around him shimmered with heat as his bronze skin glowed red-hot. Those who came too near felt the cruel embrace of a guardian made of metal and magic. Yet Talos was not a creature of passion or malice. He was a sentinel without voice or heart, a being bound to duty without choice or rest. His endless march was both gift and curse, a life without pause or companion. The people of Crete knew Talos as a constant presence. They left offerings of olives, figs, and wine at cliff edges, a silent thanks to their silent protector. They neither feared nor loved him, for he was not a man, but an eternal guardian who belonged to the island and the gods. Talos walked beneath sun and moon, his steps stirring dust in daylight and falling softly on stone at night. His gaze followed the horizon, the distant sails, the dark shapes moving across the water. He never spoke, he never rested, he simply kept his endless watch. The gods who fashioned Talos watched with mixed pride and unease. They had made a protector perfect in strength, yet imperfect in spirit. They feared what would happen if the sentinel lost control, if the unyielding force of bronze turned against those it was meant to guard. Their whispers carried warnings in temple, shadows of creation's dangers and limits. Some said Talos was once a man cursed or preserved in bronze, a soul trapped in eternal vigilance. Others believed he was pure magic and metal, a golem made to obey without feeling. Whatever the truth, he became a symbol of creation's double edge of power and peril. Imagine yourself standing on the rocky shore, under a sky painted with stars, the cool breeze brushing your skin, the soft scent of salt and wild herbs, the slow, steady beat of footsteps on stone, a rhythm ancient and calming, the faint warmth of bronze glowing softly in the moonlight, a heartbeat that echoes through time. In Talos' endless march, we find a quiet meditation on creation and duty, on strength and solitude, a reminder that even the greatest power carries the weight of loneliness, that what we build may outlast us, and that even gods may fear the hands that shape the world. Let your breath slow and your mind soften as you follow the rhythm of Talos' footsteps. Feel the gentle pulse of the island, the waves, the wind, the rustling leaves, and drift deeper into calm rest. For in this story of a bronze guardian whose steps never falter lies a quiet lullaby from the past, a tale to carry you gently towards sleep as the ancient world fades into night. The island's contours stretched beneath an endless sky, shifting softly from morning as pale gold to midday's warm glow. Olive trees waved gently in the breeze, their leaves shimmering like whispers caught between earth and air. The scent of wild herbs mingled with salt, carried on winds that had traveled far across the sea. Each stone and cliff held echoes of time old as the gods themselves, and walking steadily along these shores was Talos, a bronze giant whose presence was as constant as the tide. His footsteps drummed the quiet song on the rocky paths, a rhythm unbroken, steady, and sure. His bronze skin reflected sunlight in flickers of molten gold like fire, captured in stillness. The faint warmth of his body touched the air around him, a soft heat beneath the cool sea breeze. He moved with purpose, but no haste, his gaze ever watchful, scanning the horizon where water met sky. The story of Talos is one of creation and burden, crafted by divine hands from molten metal infused with ancient magic. He was designed to guard, to protect, and to endure beyond mortal limits. His single vein sealed tightly carried the ichor. Was his lifeblood a thread connecting metal to the divine? Yet this life was also his weakness. For if the flow within that vein was broken or drained, the sentinel would fall silent, motionless, bound to his endless vigil. Talos had no rest, no speech, no companion. He was strength without feeling, a guardian without heart. The villagers who lived beneath his watch understood his nature. They left humble offerings at cliff edges, olives, figs, wine, poured softly onto the earth. These gifts were silent, thanks to a protector who never asked for praise. Talos was neither friend nor foe, but a steady presence like the sun or sea. As the days passed, the light shifted slowly through the sky, and Talos kept his watch. Under the bright sun, his bronze glowed warm beneath the midday heat. At twilight, the shadows stretched long, and his eyes shone softly like stars awakening. At night, his footsteps fell gently on the cool stone, the quiet thrum of a heartbeat unseen. The gods who gave Talos life watched with both pride and unease. Their creation was perfect in strength, yet lacking in soul. They feared the power they had unleashed, fearing the guardian might become a threat. Their whispers filled temple halls, warning of creation's limits and the cost of making life without breath. Some tales told that Talos was once a man trapped in bronze, a soul condemned to eternal watchfulness. Others said he was a creature born of fire and metal, without thought or will. Yet all agreed he was a symbol of the tension between power and vulnerability, a reminder that even the hands of gods must reckon with what they create. Imagine yourself now standing on the edge of the rocky shore, the cool sea breeze brushing your skin, the distant call of seabirds echoing softly, the steady cadence of footsteps on stone, the ancient rhythm of a sentinel's march, the faint glow of bronze beneath the rising moon, a pulse in the quiet night. Feel the gentle rocking of the waves, the scent of salt and thyme, the rustling of leaves. Let the soft rhythm of Talos' footsteps guide you deeper into calm and rest, a lullaby carried on the wind across time and sea. And as you listen, know that even in the oldest myths, the steady flow of time holds all things that the eternal march of a bronze guardian is also a quiet song of endurance and peace. So let your breath grow slow and your mind soften and drift with the rhythm of ancient footsteps as the world fades softly into night. As the first light of dawn touches the horizon, the island of Crete slowly wakes beneath skies brushed with soft hues of lavender and pale gold. The olive trees shimmer faintly in the morning breeze, and the sea stretches wide and calm, reflecting the gentle promise of a new day. Along the rocky coast, Talos continues his endless vigil, his footsteps, a steady beat upon stone echoing softly in the cool morning air. His bronze form glows faintly in the soft light, a quiet presence watching the boundary where earth meets sea. Though bound by duty and magic, Talos carries no anger or pride, only the silent acceptance of his timeless task. He is neither god nor man, but a sentinel between worlds, a living symbol of the complex dance between creation and control. The villagers who rise to tend their fields and gather their harvests do so beneath his watchful gaze. Their lives move to the rhythm of the seasons, the ebb and flow of tides, and the steady steps of their guardian. Small offerings left at cliff edges remind Talos that though silent, he is seen and honored. The gods themselves look on with a mixture of pride and unease, knowing that in their forging of Talos, they created both protector and paradox, a being of strength and solitude, bound forever to an unchanging path. A reminder that the acts of creation carry with them both power and burden. Imagine yourself now standing at the water's edge, feeling the cool spray of sea mist upon your skin, the soft murmur of waves caressing the shore, the distant cry of a lone seabird on the wind, the faint warmth of bronze beneath the morning sun, and the slow, measured rhythm of footsteps on stone. Let these sensations flow gently through you as you breathe in and out in time with the sentinel as march. Feel the quiet strength of Talos carrying you toward rest, the soft pulse of history and myth blending with the present moment. And as the day begins, know that in the story of Talos, there is a lullaby of endurance, a quiet song of peace. So now, as you settle deeper into comfort, allow the steady cadence of ancient footsteps to guide your mind. The slow dance of bronze on stone, the endless watch of a guardian who asks only to protect and endure. Let your thoughts drift softly as the world fades into stillness and sleep. This concludes Segment 1, The Story of Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete, a tale of creation, duty, and quiet strength. A chapter from the past that carries us gently forward into dreams. The cautionary tale of Typhon. Imagine the gods sitting quietly in the high halls of Mount Olympus, a place above the clouds where the air is thin and still, and the world below seems distant and slow, like the ripples of a forgotten memory. The gods are eternal, or so they think, yet even they remember. Fear not often. But occasionally when the wind shifts and the silence grows too complete, a name surfaces in their thoughts, unspoken, but never quite forgotten: Typhon. The whisper of it sends an echo through the marble halls and causes the soft golden fire in the braziers to flicker. You see, Typhon was not born like the others. He was not a child of careful planning or divine celebration. His existence was not toasted with nectar or watched with pride by his creators. Instead, Typhon was forged from a feeling, from something darker and older than order. He was a response, not an intention. After the gods defeated the mighty Titans in a battle that shook the very foundation of the heavens, they believed peace would follow. Zeus and his siblings had imprisoned the Titans deep in the belly of the earth, in the dark void of Tartarus, and from the stillness that followed, they imagined dominion calm and complete. But Earth herself, Gaia, the mother of mountains and rivers, forests and sky, had felt a great loss in that war. Titan children were vanquished, bound in chains, and hidden from the light. And in the deep echoing sorrow of that loss, she birthed something new, something ancient, yet unseen. Gaia mated with Tartarus, the chasm, the abyss, and from that union came Typhon. He did not enter the world as a crying babe or a smiling child, but rather as a towering mass of chaos and sound, taller than the mountains and broader than the horizon. His body was a patchwork of monstrous parts, each more dreadful than the last. And yet, it is important to remember, we are not here to tremble, but to understand. And so, let us see Typhon, not through the eyes of fear, but through the lens of awe and stillness. His form rose high into the clouds, his shoulders brushing against the stars, his arms stretching across entire valleys, one ending in 100 writhing serpent heads, the other twisting into vast wings, not quite bird-like, not quite dragon-like, but something between. Each head of the serpents spoke a different tongue. They hissed and growled, some chanted in deep, forgotten dialects, some sang, and others laughed in a way that did not sound like joy. His lower half coiled into the earth, like roots that did not grow, but instead clung and claimed the ground, his legs ending in coils of vipers that slithered where feet might have stepped. His eyes burned not with fire, but with intention, with knowing, with the cold recognition of one who had not been invited into the world, but had arrived anyway. And though Typhon was terrible to behold, there was a strange rhythm to him, as well, a kind of living force that pulsed with the wind and cracked the clouds and stirred the forests into uneasy quiet. He was not simply a destroyer, but a mirror, a reminder that power once suppressed can take on wild and unexpected shapes. When the gods first learned of his coming, they laughed softly, thinking it another strange creature of the earth, easily managed and soon forgotten. But the laughter faded as the sky darkened, not with storm or cloud, but with presence. Typhon rose from the land itself, from the edge of the world where the mountains curled into the sea and the rivers stopped remembering their names. He did not speak with words, but with his arrival, the message was clear. You have forgotten that not all things born of gods bow to them. He moved slowly across the land, not rampaging, but steady and deliberate, his footsteps silent, yet they caused tremors beneath the temples. His gaze gentle, yet the olive trees withered when he passed. The gods looked upon him, and for the first time in many ages, remembered what it was to be unsure. Zeus gathered the Olympians in the central hall, their voices low and uncertain. Even mighty Hera did not speak at first, and Poseidon, who ruled the seas, stood very still, as if listening to something rising from the depths. Apollo, who saw the future, said nothing. And then, without warning, Typhon arrived. He did not tear down. Olympus, he did not shout or rage. He merely stood at the foot of the mountain and waited. His breath warmed the stones and caused the snow to melt. His eyes stared into the marble, and the marble cracked from within. Zeus rose with his thunderbolt and descended the peak to face him, and there in the space, between mountain and monster, something ancient was reenacted. Order faced chaos, not to destroy, but to prove who would endure. The battle was not quick. It lasted not in hours or days, but in echoes and shifts, in seasons and strange silences that fell across the land. Typhon struck not with violence, but with transformation. Rivers reversed for a time, and forests forgot how to grow. Fish fell from the sky, and birds walked across lakes while the moon refused to rise. Yet Zeus held steady, not through force, but through insistence. His lightning did not scorch, but reminded the sky of its pattern. His voice was not loud, but steady. Eventually, Typhon was weakened not by wounds, but by weariness, for chaos cannot persist without something to unravel. And Zeus refused to break. Typhon retreated. But he was not slain. Instead, Zeus imprisoned him beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, and there he remains not dead, but dreaming. The volcano above is said to be his breath, his sighs, his movements in restless sleep. And the gods remember. They remember that there are things even they fear, not because those things are evil, but because they cannot be controlled, and Typhon remains the monument to that lesson. Not all things born of the earth bow to Olympus. Some remain wild and waiting. And now, as the wind drifts over the slopes of ancient Etna, and the stars blink slowly above the quiet sea, you might imagine Typhon still turning in his sleep, murmuring in the language of old serpents in forgotten mountains. He waits not with rage, but with presence. And the gods above shift in their halls not often, but sometimes when the fire flickers too suddenly, or the ground hums beneath their feet, they remember, and that is enough. Echidna and the long sleep of monsters. Imagine once again the gods in their high golden halls, the sky beyond their pillars painted with twilight and wind, and below them the earth is quiet for a time, but not empty, never truly still. For deep beneath the surface, where the roots no longer grow and the soil gives way to something thicker, darker, older, there is a presence curled not in anger, but in observation. Her name was Echidna. You may not have heard it often, for she was not like Athena in shining armor, or Artemis with her bow. She did not walk among mortals in disguise, or inspire poets and oracles. She was not seen in marble, nor praised in hymns, but she was there, and still she waits. Echidna was called the mother of monsters, not as a curse, nor even as a title, but as a quiet truth that the gods acknowledged only in moments of reflection. She was born of ancient union, some say from the sea and the earth, others say from Phorcys and Ceto, old gods of the deep and the hidden. And it does not matter which is true, because Echidna was not meant to be known in full. She was meant to be felt like the hush that falls over a forest at dusk, or the way a cave seems to breathe when no wind is near. Her body was strange by the standards of Olympus, though not by the standards of the world, for the world is full of strange, and Echidna belonged to it more than the gods ever did. She was part woman and part serpent, her upper form radiant and still like a statue, half submerged in sand, her lower half coiled and vast made, not of scales, but of slow, timeless muscle that pulsed in harmony with the earth. She lived far from Olympus, far from men, in a hidden cave that opened only when the sky forgot itself and the mountain nearby did not speak its name. And there she dwelled not in silence, but in slow rhythm and patient vigil. She did not wage war like Typhon, nor challenge Olympus directly, but instead she did something far more unsettling. She endured and she created. From her came the Chimera, and the Sphinx, the Nemean lion, and Cerberus, the Hydra that grew 2 heads for everyone lost, and the eagle that feasted endlessly on the liver of a chained god. Each child a story, each child a whisper of something the gods could not fully undo. They would send heroes to slay them, of course, brave mortals armed with blades and blessings, and they would win more often than not for the sake of order and tale and legacy. But the gods knew where those monsters came from, and they knew that. Echidna did not mourn when her children were destroyed, nor did she rejoice when they lived. She simply watched and waited, She was not driven by hatred, nor by justice, nor by ambition. She was there because the world required her presence, just as it required rivers and droughts and a space between stars. She was balance born in secret, kept in shadow, and the gods did not know what to make of her. Zeus once sought to destroy her, to send his lightning into the cave and collapse the stone and flood the tunnels with divine fire. But he stopped not from mercy, but from something quieter than fear and more constant than doubt. He stopped because he realized he could not shape the world entirely into his image. He could rule Olympus, he could imprison Titans, he could scatter mortals across the lands and raise temples in his honor, but he could not unmake Echidna. She was too woven into the roots of the earth, too old, too still, and so he let her be. He turned his gaze from her and did not speak her name again. And still she waited, not as a threat, but as a truth. Her presence reminded the gods of something they preferred to forget, that their power was not complete, that creation always bore contrast, that even the divine must share the world with what came before and what would come after. Echidna bore no crown. She issued no commands. She spun no prophecies, yet her quiet cave lay at the crossroads of countless destinies, and every time a hero swung a sword or a beast cried in the hills, her influence pulsed beneath it all like a tide beneath the calm sea. Her cave became a place of legend, but few dared approach, for not even monsters made their homes near it, and not even the bravest seekers found joy in its stillness. For inside was not rage, but recognition, the recognition that not all things feared are loud, and not all dangers roar. Some wait in silence and patience and certainty, and so the gods turned their attention elsewhere, to wars and banquets, to marble and myth. But in the back of their minds, Echidna remained, and in the still hours of the night, when even immortality feels brittle and uncertain, they remember the soft sound of scales shifting in the dark and the warmth of breath from something vast and unseen. They remember the quiet cave and the woman who did not weep and did not sleep, but simply watched as centuries passed like clouds. Echidna, not a villain, not a queen, not a mother in the way mortals understand, but a presence. She did not wish to rule nor to destroy. She was there to witness, to give form to the hidden corners of the cosmos, to shape through stillness and birth without celebration. Her creations were not evil. They were expressions, they were tests, they were reflections of human fear and divine discomfort. And every time one fell by spear or spell, the gods felt not triumph, but a kind of relief, a sense that for now things were quiet again, but they knew it would not last. For Echidna remained, and new shapes would rise from her dreams, not as punishments, but as inevitabilities. And so the cycle continued, birth and death, rise and fall, the gods above, the monsters below, and Echidna somewhere in between. Not quite shadow, not quite mother, just a presence constant, unshaken. Imagine her now, as the wind cools through the hills of ancient lands, her cave deep beneath the earth sealed, but breathing its slow, steady breath. The monsters are gone for now, the tailies are quiet, but Echidna waits not with longing, not with vengeance, but simply because she is. And in the soft rhythm of your own breath, as you drift now between waking and sleep, you might imagine that same ancient stillness, that same hush, that same awareness, that somewhere far below, or far within, something watches, not with judgment, but with calm, unending patience. And the gods above sigh in their sleep, remembering her not with fear, but with quiet respect. They know they cannot destroy what they do not fully understand. And so they let her rest, and in doing so, they rest as well, the world continues, the cave remains, and Echidna sleeps with her eyes open. The forgotten ones, beneath Olympus, beneath the layers of marble and myth, beneath the chariots of golden gods and the thunderous halls of Olympus, lies a quieter, older presence, not carved into temple, stone not sung by traveling poets, not honored by banquets, or woven into festive garlands. This is where the primordials dwell. Not in form or figure, as the later gods would take, not with thrones or symbols or hymns, echoing in their name, but as forces as breath, as slow movements in the folds of time itself. They were there, before the sea remembered how to whisper, and before the sky learned to hold. Its shape they were not born, they simply were. They had no temples, not in the way we think of them yet. Among the crumbled remains of strange stone circles buried beneath forgotten isles, there are signs. Slight carvings etched into sandstone shapes, half remembered in later myths, worn faces on statues where the nose is gone, and the eyes seem to look not outward, but inward. There were those among mortals who tried to understand them, who tried to reach back into the dark and call them by name. They were called the cults of the forgotten ones, the quiet veneration, the circle of deep memory. They did not build large shrines, but left small markers hidden in caves behind waterfalls, within the folds of mountains, places where few would wander, places where the wind spoke more often than men. Nyx was night, but not darkness in the way we know her, was the veil not of sleep, but of silence. She did not bring dreams, but stillness, her wings wide enough to cradle the world, her form. Never seen, only felt when the stars turned slower and the moon blinked behind the clouds. They say that even Zeus, the king of all gods, feared Nyx, not because she threatened, but because she could not be touched by thunder, could not be swayed by speech, could not be bribed by offering. She simply was. And her presence reminded him of a time before he ruled, a time before rule itself had meaning. The cults of Nyx left no great writings, only patterns drawn in ash on cave floors, spirals that, like stars, sinking into wells songs, hummed not sung lines, carved into stone in a language that resembled breathing more than speech. Then there was chaos, not as disorder, but as the great yawning potential, the space where all things begin and all things return, a concept not shaped into deity until much later. In the early myths, chaos was not a figure, but a presence, a vastness without. Edges and the cults did not speak to chaos. They simply waited beside it, sat in silence. Beside the abyss, imagined themselves as drops within a vast sea without shore. Chaos was not feared by them, but honored for its honesty, for its lack of desire, its pure, endless openness. They would gather near volcanic vents, not for heat, but for the deep groan of the earth, which reminded them of the earliest movement, the first breath of the universe. They wore no robes, lit no fires, just sat in rings of stone with their eyes open, listening to the world, forgetting them. Then came Erebus, the shadow, not cast by flame, but by existence itself, the shadow behind the soul, the one that stretches not across ground, but within. His cult built underground chambers with no altars, only corridors that led nowhere dim. Lanterns burned oil that smelled of the ocean, and salt and time, and as they descended, they would carry nothing but a name in their mind, their own name, which they would give away in the deepest chamber and forget. In that forgetting, they believed they came closer to Erebus, to the space where being and unbeing meet. And Ennang, she was inevitability. She was not fate. She was the curve of the river that cannot be straightened, the stone that rolls even uphill. If it is meant to, she was the law behind all law, not written, not declared, only known. Her followers would inscribe circles within circles on old bone, and let them sink into bogs, believing that the earth would carry their acceptance into the soil, and that she would notice not them, but the pattern itself. Anant was not kind nor cruel. She was, and is, and will be. Even the gods feared her in a way, for she answered to no Olympian, no Titan, no force at all. She was the reason Olympus rose, and the reason it will fall, though it has not yet. Remnants of these cults are scattered like dust, caught in forgotten pockets of wind, a clay tablet with no writing, only raised. Ridges a spiral shell, found in a mountain tomb. A mask carved of wood, so old it crumbles to the breath. Archaeologists find them and label them as unknown religious objects or possible ritual implements. But the truth is softer and stranger than that. These objects were not meant to be found. They were meant to be left behind on purpose. Quiet tokens of an understanding not shared, only felt the gods above moved with thunder and glory. They demanded temples and tribute and fear and joy, but the primordials needed none of it. They were not jealous or wrathful or loving. They simply were. And those who knew of them did not try to change their fate or ask. For gifts they only sat and breathed, and remembered that they were part of something vast, something before and after story. Even now, if you wander far enough into a forest where no trails have ever been cut, or into the mouth of a cave, where the air tastes like stone, you might feel it. The slow awareness of something older than memory. You might place your hand on a rock and feel it warm, though no sun touches it. Or hear a sound in the stillness that does not belong to wind or bird. That is the space where the primordials still breathe. They have not vanished, only withdrawn. They wait like mist in the folds of the morning, like the deep. Hush before snow. They are not gone. They are simply elsewhere. And perhaps in your own dreams, when the world grows quiet and your breath falls into rhythm with the turning of the earth, you will meet them not in form, not in story, but in presence. A feeling that something watches, not with eyes, but with being. And in that moment, you will not be afraid. You will be still like them. You will remember not who you are, but you are. A part of the pattern, a thread in the weave. And the gods above and the mortals below will pass and rise and fall and forget. But the primordials remain. Always. Living among the myths the gods feared. Imagine for a moment a small village nestled along the edge of a forest where the trees sway quietly, even when the wind is still a village. Not carved into maps, nor sung in epic poems, yet older than cities, older than empires, resting quietly on soil that remembers every footstep that has ever touched it. The sun has just begun to lower itself beyond the hills, and the air is soft with the smell of dust and olive and distant wood smoke. And as you walk slowly through the winding path of this village, you see the world as it was once lived, not by kings or warriors, but by those who watched the sky and listened for stories in the silence. The people here do not speak the names of the gods loudly, nor do they challenge them openly. They know the stories. They know the lineage of power and betrayal and punishment and gift. But what they understand most of all is this. The gods are not always protectors. Sometimes the gods are afraid. And when gods fear something, mortals listen very closely to what they fear. In this village, there is a stone at the center of the square, not large, not grand, and yet has stood longer than memory itself, carved not with images, but with a smooth round hollow at its top, filled always with olive oil, no matter the season, no matter the harvest. No one steals from this stone, not even the poorest child. They believe the stone was placed here long ago in memory of something that no longer has a name, a thing that walked in the woods before the trees grew tall, before the soil remembered how to bear fruit. The elders say the stone is not a monument, but a boundary, a soft agreement between people and whatever came before and beyond. They say the gods once sent a bolt of fire into the forest to strike down what lived there, and that the next morning only ash and footprints remained, and so the people poured oil onto the stone and whispered nothing at all. Even now they do not light candles near the stone, nor leave flowers, only oil and silence. And in this we begin to understand how ordinary life wove itself around divine fears, how society took the shape not only of worship, but of cautious remembrance. In wealthier cities where marble shines and fountains sing, the same fears persist, only wrapped in elegance and spoken through ritual. In the temples of Delphi and Eleusis in Corinth and Athens, the rites are not simply for honoring gods, but for reinforcing boundaries, for naming what must not be invited. When priests walk barefoot through sacred groves at dawn, they do so not only to commune with Apollo or Demeter, but also to listen to the places where myth touches soil, to watch for signs that something older than the gods has stirred. Even in the heart of city festivals where flutes trill and dancers spin, there are moments of stillness. Rituals designed not to celebrate, but to contain moments where the music halts and the priestess offers barley to the earth, not upward, but downward into small pits carved in the floor. They are not offerings of joy, they are payments of recognition, quiet gestures that say we remember and we accept. The people believed that to live safely was not to deny the monstrous, but to live beside it carefully, respectfully. In homes, even the humblest clay dwellings, there would be a niche, a shallow carved space, not for idols, but for shadow, a place left empty, where the unknown could rest and not be denied. Children were taught not to whistle at night, not to speak the names of certain creatures during rain, not because they would summon them, but because the air listens more closely when the world is unsettled. And in noble households where feasts were held and poets recited tales of heroes and war, the walls were decorated with scenes of gods in triumph, but also with small hidden figures. Tucked into the background, monstrous forms with serpent eyes and long-forgotten names, not to glorify, but to acknowledge. Even the architecture of temples reflected this balance. Some doorways were built too narrow or too low, not for function, but for protection. It was believed that certain creatures feared constriction, and that passageways could confuse them, lead them in circles, trap them in geometric patterns they could not untangle. It was said that labyrinths were not only stories, but philosophy's reminders that even chaos had patterns, and those patterns could be honored or repeated to keep fear at bay. In the towns near caves or cliffs where legends said Typhon once passed, or Echidna once slept, people grew their olive trees not in rows, but in spirals. Their gardens arranged in curves, not straight lines, as though mimicking the slow breath of ancient things, the coiling logic of the earth. It's old memory, and when the moon was full and the air smelled of fennel and damp moss, they would stay indoors, not from terror, but from respect. Their fear was not loud, it was gentle, a daily humility threaded into the rituals of living. Fishermen did not cast nets near. Certain rock formations, said to be older than Poseidon himself, shepherds would turn back their flocks from fields, where the soil was too dark or too soft, where nothing ever grew, though the rains fell faithfully. And if ever someone disappeared, if a child wandered too far, or a traveler never returned, they did not cry out or shout into the wild. They lit a small fire and spoke no names. In this way, society moved like a current around a stone, bending, not breaking, holding its shape, but adjusting, always mindful of what cannot be controlled. The elite were not immune to this, either. Even the rulers, who built statues of gods taller than their palaces, knew that power was a story agreed upon by many, and beneath that story were other stories more silent and more enduring. Kings and queens would keep small tokens near their beds, animal teeth wrapped in linen bones, carved with circular symbols gifted by quiet women who came from distant hills and spoke in slow riddles. They called them charms or protections, but they were really admissions that even at the height of wealth and command there are forces that slip through cracks and settle in corners and drift beneath stone floors. And so their lives, too, were shaped by this reverent fear, a kind of shadow agreement between human and divine, between divine and monstrous, between known and unknown. Even festivals of joy like the Dionysia were carefully timed, not simply for the pleasure of wine and play, but to mark the turn of seasons, when the veil between myth and soil thinned, when stories walked close to the world, and the gods remembered what they feared. Masks worn during these celebrations were not only theatrical, they were ritual, they were armor to confuse and protect the wearer from being recognized by anything watching from beyond. They say that some dancers would forget who they were during these nights, that they would speak in voices, not their own, and afterward remember nothing, and the people did not question it. They simply washed their faces and gave thanks, not to be spared, but to be remembered safely. And so it was that across the cities and villages of the ancient Greek world, fear and reverence wove a fabric that covered the daily acts of cooking and harvesting, praying and mourning. A fabric not woven in panic, but in continuity, Not all monsters came crashing down from the mountains, and not all dangers roared. Some waited in memory and silence, and those who lived closest to myth knew that the best way to survive, it was to let it rest undisturbed, to offer oil to the stone, to leave one doorway crooked, to whisper once and then fall silent, to remember what even the gods dared not forget. Where fear became culture and ritual became memory imagined, again the quiet villages, the narrow marble streets, the torchlit paths of temples high on cliffs and low by rivers. But this time, look, deeper not just at how people moved, but how they shaped their world around invisible boundaries. Boundaries built not with walls, but with stories, whispered through centuries of caution. Among the people of ancient Greece, the gods were not always seen as guardians, but as forces to be navigated, revered, and sometimes carefully avoided. And so, society adapted not in sudden declarations, but in slow habits that wrapped around life like ivy on stone, shaping everything from how a child was named to how the dead were sent back into the earth, even before a child's first breath. Parents consulted seers, not for fortune, but for warning. They did not ask who the child would become, but whether the moment of birth was safe, whether any divine or monstrous eye was watching, whether some unseen echo stirred nearby. Names were chosen not to please the gods, but to deflect attention. Certain syllables were believed to confuse the spirits. Others were thought to hide the child within the name, like a veil. And these practices were handed down quietly, generation after generation. Education, too, was shaped by these shadows' young boys who studied. Homer and Herodotus were taught not only the glory of heroes, but the dangers they faced, and often those dangers were not human, not even godly, but born of something older. They read not to learn how to conquer, but how to endure, how to speak carefully, how to recognize signs of imbalance in the world around them. A crooked tree, a spring that dried without reason, a statue that crumbled without age, all were seen as omens not of fate, but of presence. Presence of something older than Olympus, something that the gods themselves once feared and pushed into corners of the earth and sea. And so the teachers in dusty courtyards, with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes, taught their students to observe not only stars and verses, but the quiet, the unchanging, the cracks in the pattern. Even the law was built with myth in its marrow, not simply in the stories of divine justice, but in how crime and punishment reflected the balance between order and chaos. Murder was punished harshly, not just for the loss of life, but for the belief that it invited something in something ancient that fed on blood and memory, and if not properly addressed, could grow roots in the very soil of the city. Certain crimes required not only justice, but ritual banishment. The accused would be exiled, not to protect people from them, but to protect the city from what might follow them. Their clothes were burned, their names were struck from records, their houses left to decay, sometimes even salted, so that nothing would grow there again. And it was believed that, in doing this, the imbalance was sealed, the doorway closed. The laws were mirrors of fear, not of panic, but of remembrance, of the understanding that once something truly monstrous had walked the earth, and that its footprints remained hidden in habit. Burial customs, too, carried these echoes of divine fear. The dead were not simply mourned, they were sealed, carefully wrapped, and weighed down with tokens to guide or confuse them, coins, placed not only for passage across the river, but also to distract, to bribe, to delay, to ensure that the soul moved forward and not backward. Sometimes graves were dug at crossroads, where four paths met not because it was convenient, but because it was believed. The restless dead would become lost in the turning and be unable to find their way back home. And in homes where someone had died suddenly or strangely, the door was left ajar for days, not for air, but for spirit to leave in peace, and a bowl of water was placed by the threshold to reflect the soul so that it would see itself and know it no longer belonged among the living. All of this was not superstition, but culture carefully passed and deeply believed, a culture built not only on the worship of power, but on the recognition of danger, and this recognition shaped art as well. In pottery, we see monsters always at the edge, never quite center in murals. We see serpents curled behind columns, gorgons peering from shield rims, not as decoration, but as constant presence reminders that beauty and terror lived side by side, and that fear could be honored not only in words, but in form. In elite circles, fear was refined, not removed. The wealthiest homes contained secret chambers for private rites, floors lined with black tiles said to absorb misfortune, herbs hung upside down. In kitchens, not only to dry, but to ward off attention from unseen things that might linger in the scent. Symposia, the great drinking feasts of philosophers and poets, were often concluded with silence, a final hour where no music played, no laughter rose, and each guest was left alone with their thoughts, for it was believed that joy too loud could summon envy from the old world, and that silence soothed what watched from below. In Sparta, warriors were taught not only courage, but awareness, taught to feel changes in wind and silence in birdsong, trained to recognize the presence of something unseen before a battle. They sat not in chants of bravery, but in long stillness, believing that if something stirred from beneath the earth, they would feel it first. Even among the highest priests, those who interpreted omens and held the ears of kings, there were practices that spoke not of pride, but of quiet caution. Robes worn inside out to confuse the gaze of ancient beings, chants spoken backward at dawn when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest. And in every city, whether rich or poor, whether perched on a hill or nestled near the sea, there was always one place left untouched, one stretch of land or hollow or ruin where no one went and no one spoke of it, not out of ignorance, but because they remembered something that could not be explained. Sometimes these places were fenced with stone or olive trees, sometimes not marked at all, yet everyone knew, and they walked widely around them. They let children play elsewhere. They did not plant nor harvest, they simply let it be. This was not avoidance, but agreement, a quiet pact between the world that can be shaped and the one that cannot. And in this way, the fear that once moved gods to act became part of the very shape of mortal life, not as terror, but as pattern, as rhythm, as a way of stepping lightly in a world filled with echoes. The myths were not just stories, they were instructions. They were the breath of memory passed from firelight to temple, from old hands to young eyes. They reminded people that even the divine is not beyond fear, and that those fears remain in the folds of the world, just out of reach. And as the centuries passed, and temples fell, and new gods rose and faded, the old habits lingered in how a door was built, or how a traveler was greeted, or how a prayer was whispered, not to the sky, but to the soil. It is said that even now, when ruins crumble and fields are plowed for the first time in 100 years, farmers will pause at what they find: a strange stone, a bone too large to be beast, a shard with eyes etched too deep, and they will not take it home. They will leave it where it lies and pour a little oil and walk away in silence, because some fears are not forgotten, only folded into the earth and into the shape of human life. And as night falls again, and the stars begin their slow turning above the old roads and ancient rivers, one can still feel the weight of that remembering, not heavy, but ever present, like the sound of a deep drum, too far to hear, but not far enough to forget. And in the stillness of the present, the gods dream, and their fears sleep with them, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, not with threat, but with presence. And life continues around them, shaped by stories, softened by ritual, held in place not by control, but by care. And so the world turns quietly, as it always has. The gods who feared themselves, imagine the great throne room of Olympus, not lit with flame, but with a steady blue light that comes not from torches, but from the slow burn of eternity. Marble columns stretch into mist. The floor is polished smooth, not by labor, but by time itself. And the gods sit not in joy, but in vigil. They do not speak often, for they have said it all before. And still the silence reminds them of what they have done and what they have become. They are gods, yes, but they are also descendants of fear. Before Olympus there was chaos. Before chaos there was nothing, and after nothing came, Gaia and Uranus, and from them came the Titans, and from the Titans came war, and from war came fire, and from fire came fear. Zeus, king of gods, does not forget the taste of stone, for he once swallowed prophecy in the form of his siblings, hidden in the dark belly of his father, and regurgitated them not with rage, but with inevitability. He overthrew his father, not because he was brave, but because he was afraid. Afraid of what? Kronos had become, and more afraid of what he might become himself. That is the shape of godhood in ancient thought. Not a gift, not a reward, not even a curse, but a cycle. A wheel that turns with slow, echoing certainty. Each generation fears the next. Each one reaches back to hold power and forward to hold it at bay. The Olympians did not escape this pattern. They learned to polish it too. Soften its edges to hide the fear beneath festivals and feasts and statues. But deep in the folds of Olympus, behind the laughter and thunder, lies the quiet question that never leaves. Who will rise next? Zeus once looked upon Athena not with pride, but with calculation. He had swallowed her mother, Metis, to prevent prophecy, and yet Athena emerged fully formed from his own skull, a warrior goddess not born of woman, but from thought and pain. And though he made her his favorite, he wondered always if she too would rise. He watched Apollo with his bright gaze, and his prophecies, and his ever-expanding temples, and he wondered, will the people turn from me to him? He watched Artemis with her independence and her forests, where no law applied, and he wondered, will the wild reject my order? And so he kept them close, but not too close, gave them honors, but not too many, made them powerful, but not sovereign. He ruled not alone, but cautiously. Even Hera, his queen, whose eyes burned with eternal memory, he watched for. She knew what it meant to be betrayed, and betrayal, once known, is never forgotten. The gods spoke often of mortals, of wars and justice and love, but rarely did they speak of succession. Rarely did they name the next, because to name is to invite. To name is to give shape to the unknown, and the unknown is what they feared most of all. They remembered what they had done to their own parents, how the Titans had ruled and been cast down, not because they were cruel, but because their time had passed, and no god wishes to hear that their time too will pass. And so they clung not to power, but to the illusion of permanence. They built temples not to honor themselves, but to anchor themselves to the earth, to remind all who lived and died, below, that the sky above would never change. But even stone wears down, even myths crumble. There were moments when cracks formed, not in marble, but in certainty, when a new god was born with strange domains like fear, or sleep, or chaos, and the old gods whispered among themselves, who is their mother? Who is their father? What have we forgotten? The fear was not that the god would destroy them, but that the god would change them, that they would no longer be at the center of the tale. And so they wove themselves deeper into the story. Zeus became father of all, not just by birth, but by proclamation. Hera became queen, not only of Olympus, but of marriage and order and legacy. Athena claimed wisdom and strategy and law. Apollo took the sun, not because it was his, but because it needed a keeper. Each domain was claimed and guarded. And when a new thing appeared, when mortals dreamed of ideas not yet given a name, the gods hurried to assign one. Because to leave it unnamed was to risk being replaced. They did not fear monsters in the way mortals did. They feared silence. They feared being forgotten. They feared the slow erosion of story in Delphi, where the oracle whispered beneath the breath of Apollo. The future was never spoken plainly, because even the gods cannot face clear endings. The Pythia spoke in riddles, not to confuse, but to protect, to give prophecy a veil behind which fear could rest. When mortals asked who would win a war, or who would die, she answered not with names, but with shapes, with wind and stone and shadow. And the gods listened too. They came quietly in the form of owls or smoke, and listened not for answers, but for warnings, because they knew the truth. They ruled not because they were eternal, but because they were remembered. And memory is a fragile thing. In ancient cities, the priests told stories to children, not just to teach them faith, but to keep the gods strong. Each myth recited was like weaving another thread into a tapestry that held Olympus above the clouds. And so even the gods became dependent on those below. Their power bound to the rhythm of prayer and ritual. They were divine, yes, but also vulnerable. And their fear grew not with thunder, but with time they watched as heroes rose and mortals built their own stories as altars grew dusty and temples cracked. And they wondered, will there come a time when no one speaks our names? When the sky is just sky, and the sea just water, and the stories just wind. And so they doubled their efforts. More festivals, more shrines, more dreams planted in sleeping minds, more signs in stars and storms. Not because they loved mankind, but because they needed them, they needed to be remembered. Because what the gods feared most was not death. It was fading. It was silence. It was stillness. It was becoming what they had overthrown, a memory beneath the mountain, a name without a voice, a statue worn smooth by rain. And so the cycle turned not with fire, but with longing, not with rage, but with repetition. And the gods sat on their thrones and smiled. And behind their smiles they waited, watched, listened, because even gods have gods, and even gods must sleep and dream of being remembered. When gods remembered the deep things, high above the clouds where the cold never falls, and the stars feel near enough to hear the gods of Olympus rest upon their golden thrones. But they do not sleep, not as mortals sleep. Instead, they remember. They remember not just the deeds that made them kings and queens of heaven, but the things they once feared and perhaps still do. For even in eternity, there is echo. Even in divinity, there is the pulse of unease. And though time moves differently for gods, it still moves, and in that slow march things are not forgotten, only softened. Zeus sits with his hand resting on the thunderbolt, but his gaze is elsewhere, turned toward the edge of the world, where night has no name, where old winds blow, and where his dreams take shape without, form without color, only the weight of a memory too deep to rise to the surface. The other gods feel it too. Poseidon, who commands the oceans, often turns his head toward the deepest trench, where light has never been, and thinks, not of fish, nor ships, nor storms, but of the time before the sea had a name, when it was only movement and hunger, when things swam that were never sung. Hades far below hears the rhythm of the underworld, the steady whisper of souls arriving and fading, and even he wonders what lies beneath his kingdom, what sleeps in caverns older than Tartarus, what wakes without being summoned. Even the lesser gods, those who tend to music and harvest and hearth, feel the shadow of it, the delicate presence of something not threatening, but ancient, older than their names, older than the language that shaped them. And so the gods hold court not with triumph, but with caution. They speak of justice and fate and glory, but beneath their words is always the unspoken, the things that came before the Titans and the things that might come after. There are rules even among immortals, and many of them were not written by the Olympians. They inherited them. When the gods rose against the Titans, they did not break the old order entirely. They only repainted it, reshaped it, softened it, so that it might bend more easily to their desires. But in truth, they feared to destroy it completely, for fear that what was buried beneath would rise through the cracks. In rituals performed by mortals, the gods find a kind of anchor, a reminder that they still exist, not just in form, but in thought. And so they listen carefully to each prayer, not out of kindness, but necessity, for when the last voice ceases to speak, their name they too begin to unravel slowly, not violently, but with the quietness of fog lifting from a valley. It is said that some gods keep memories like relics, wrapped in silk, hidden in the hollows of Olympus, bones of monsters, feathers of creatures long extinct, broken talismans from a time when shape was still learning itself, and that, when they look upon these things, they do not smile. They are still. They remember that they are not first. They remember that they are not forever. They remember that the cosmos itself is not a kingdom, but a breath, and that breath continues, even if their names fade from the lips of mankind. Mortals built altars with hands that trembled not just in awe, but in worry. They offered wine and wheat and song, not simply to gain favor, but to hold back a silence that might fill the sky if the gods disappeared. And so gods and mortals lived in mutual recognition, bound together by memory and hope and the thin, fragile boundary between now and then. But the gods knew the truth. They knew that even myths decay, that even stories lose shape and wander, that even the most beautiful temple will one day become ruin, that ivy will find the cracks and rain will smooth the carvings until only shadow remains. And it is that shadow they fear. Not the monsters, not the rivals, not the wars, but the moment when they are no longer needed, no longer feared, no longer remembered. For what is a god without a voice to name them? What is a throne without eyes to look up in wonder? What is Olympus if no one dreams of it? They look down upon the earth and see change not as enemy, but as erosion slow, unrelenting, indifferent. They see cities rise without their blessing lovers, live without their curses. Heroes fall without their prophecy. They see candles burned for other named stars, charted for other signs, and they wonder how long. How long before their faces become masks, before their stories become metaphors, before their power becomes symbol, before symbol becomes silence. There are whispers even among the gods of a time, beyond time, when the cycle ends not in flame, but in forgetfulness a time, when mortals no longer remember who swallowed, who turned who into stone, who flew too close to the sun, a time when the myths lie dormant, not dead, but sleeping, folded like old cloth in the attic of the world. And so they linger, they weave themselves into every corner, they send dreams and visions, they plant omens and signs. They leave fingerprints on fate, not to guide, but to remain. They slip into lullabies and warnings, into poems and riddles, into quiet feelings on moonless nights. When the wind moves too slowly, they remind mortals not just that they exist, but that they were afraid once, that they built their world in response to fear, and that fear still lives in the cracks of things. In Delphi, the oracle still murmurs, not because the future demands it, but because the gods do not want silence. In Eleusis, the rites of grain and rebirth continue not because the seasons forget, but because the gods remember their own cycles, their own deaths, their own return. In forgotten caves where no god has been named for centuries, the moss still grows in spiral patterns, and if you listen closely, you might hear a sound that is not water, not wind, not beast, but presence. The presence of those who made gods and broke them, who came before the shape of fear and gave it form. And still Olympus waits. The gods do not tremble, but they do not rest. Their smiles are carved carefully, their laughter rehearsed their eye. Declarations thunderous, but beneath it all is the stillness of watching. Because the one thing they cannot strike with lightning, the one thing they cannot shape with charm or curse or chant, is the slow withering of belief. And so they hold the stories tightly, they braid them into festivals and feathers and fountains. They let mortals change the names, but keep the forms. They let the myths adapt, as long as the thread remains unbroken. Because once the thread is cut, they are no longer gods, they are echoes. And even now, in this moment, beneath the stars above your quiet breathing, they lean close, not with malice, not with pride, but with longing. Longing to be remembered, longing to be real, longing to hold back the deep quiet that waits for even the brightest throne. And you can feel it too, not as fear, but as weight. The gentle weight of stories older than language, older than prayer. The weight of gods who once feared the monsters they made, and then feared the silence they could not stop. And as your eyes grow heavy and the rhythm of sleep finds, you, that weight does not press down, but wraps softly around you like mist on the morning sea, like the breath of old wind through pine, like a dream drifting slowly through time. And the gods watch, and they wait, and they remember, as do you, the gods who were forgotten on purpose. Imagine now a space with no shape, a time with no calendar, a place before Olympus, before Titans, before even the first thunder. The world has not yet formed, and there are no temples, no names, no prayers, only movement, only hush, only presence that does not yet know itself. This is where the old gods waited, not standing, not sleeping, just existing as thought. Before words, they had no faces, no myths, no form that mortals could hold, and so they were not remembered the way. Zeus or Apollo was remembered, but they were real older than memory, older than chaos, older than creation itself. They did not ask to be worshipped. They did not command. They did not fight. They simply were, and in their being was vastness. They filled the quiet like breath in the cold. They filled the sky before there was sky, and the deep before there was water, and the soil before anything had touched it. But then shape came, and with shape came naming, and with naming came fear. The moment the world was shaped, the old gods became dangerous, not because they changed, but because the world had changed, and it no longer had room for what could not be defined. Gaia came, and then Uranus, and then Kronos, and the world gained rhythm, lineage, and time. And with time came the need to push away what had no beginning, no parent, no story. The old gods did not protest. They simply stepped back beyond the veil of clouds, beyond the reach of mountaintops, into caves that were never discovered forests that grew inward instead of outward, oceans so deep that even Poseidon did not speak of them. But the Olympians remembered, and they were afraid, not of war, but of unmaking, because what cannot be named cannot be bound, and what cannot be bound cannot be controlled, and the Olympians were gods not of essence, but of control. They needed things to have borders, domains, temples, rules, sacrifices. They needed structure and hierarchy. They needed mythology to be a map, and the old gods were not maps. They were sky without ceiling, thought, without limit, time, without motion. So the Olympians crafted stories, crafted rituals, crafted altars, not just to lift themselves, but to suppress what could not be carved into marble. And so temples were built over caves, not to honor, but to cover, not to reveal, but to seal. There are ruins even now in places where no myth lives, where no god. S name is carved where the air hangs too still, and the soil feels too soft, and the birds do not nest, and the winds do not sing. These are places where the old gods once touched the world, and where the Olympians buried that memory beneath story. Imagine a temple with no inscription, only columns, no statues, only silence. A place where the only offering is quiet. And still beneath the stone, something waits not in malice, not in hunger, just in patience. Because the old gods do not age. They do not rise or fall. They are not born or buried. They simply endure. The Olympians feared that endurance. They saw it not as wisdom, but as threat. They feared that mortals would find peace in the presence of a god that asked nothing, gave nothing, only existed without demand, without violence, without spectacle. And so the old gods were named only once, if ever, and their names were then hidden, spoken backward, or buried under layers of metaphor. They became shadows and riddles, questions and myths, pieces of broken stories that do not fit, and still they endured. Even as Zeus ruled Olympus, even as Hera measured marriages, and Athena guided thought, and Ares spilled blood, and Artemis walked alone through forests where nothing dared follow. Even as Apollo charted the stars and whispered prophecy, even as Dionysus drowned noise with wine and laughter, even as Poseidon lashed the waves and Hades kept the dead in line. Even as the world danced to the rhythm of the Olympians, the old gods simply were. There were priests who spoke of them in secret, never allowed, only in gesture, only in the shapes drawn into. Sand only in the way they avoided certain caves, or poured wine in circles, rather than lines. There were children who dreamed of them not because they were taught, but because the mind sometimes touches what history forgets. And there were dreams across the centuries that carried a certain stillness, a breath held in a room without light, where no footsteps echo. These were not dreams of fear, but of return. The Olympians tried to write them out of time, but time does not forget what was never written. In every myth there is a scene, and in every seam there is a thread, and if you pull the thread softly, slowly, without breaking it, you begin to feel the presence again. Not a voice, not a hand, not a face, just presence. And that presence does not ask it, does not chase, it does not roar. It simply waits, because it knows it always returns. The gods of shape will one day fade as shapes do. The gods of thunder and sun and law will one day become memory. And then what remains will be what always was: the first breath, the deep silence, the unformed thought, the forgotten god, and the rhythm will begin again when the gods whispered to the silence, "Now close your eyes again, and return to the places beneath the surface, not caves, but memories, not shadows, but patterns, the kind of space you enter not by walking, but by forgetting, by letting the weight of shape fall away, and what remains is stillness and breath." The gods of Olympus sat atop the world, in light, in cloud, in golden thrones with flowing robes and perfect forms, and yet they were never alone. No matter how high they built their temples, no matter how many hymns echoed through their marble halls beneath it, all the old gods remained, quiet, not hidden, but unspoken, like the space between heartbeat and breath. The old gods did not leave when Zeus threw Kronos from the sky, or when the Titans were chained in Tartarus, or when Gaia herself retreated into deep slumber. They did not leave because they had never come, they had always been, and always would be. In every myth, there is a silence in every story, a pause between sentences that feels heavier than the words that surround it. That is where they live. When a hero stares too long at the sea, not in wonder, but in unease, when a priest refuses to enter a room without knowing why, when a child cries at a statue that has no face, it is the old presence softly brushing against the edges of thought, not as warning, not as omen, simply as reminder. The Olympians built rituals not to honor, but to distract. They gave mortals stories, and prayers and symbols not as paths to truth, but as barriers between what was known and what could not be held. Because to know the old gods is to dissolve the frame of myth. And when the frame dissolves, what remains is not story, but awareness, and awareness is dangerous to those who rule by image. Imagine a village long forgotten, not on any map, not near river or mountain, only surrounded by forest, too thick to pass, and mist that never lifts. In the center of that village is a well, and around the well are stones not carved, not placed, only present. They are warm when the sun is cold, and cool when the air is hot, and no one knows why. The villagers speak of gods, but not by name. They make offerings without stories. They light fires without chants. They bow not from fear, but from recognition, as though something watches not with eyes, but with presence. That village is older than Olympus, older than time. It still exists in the corners of dreams, in the shape of certain winds, in the silence before certain songs, and the gods of Olympus, they remember it too, though they never speak of it. In their halls, there are certain questions they do not ask, and certain words they do not say, because those words are not spells or names or commands. They are keys, and once spoken, they open the breathless quiet that lies beneath the world, and in that quiet is not darkness, not chaos, not punishment, but return. The return to what was. The Olympians fear this not because they are wicked, not because they wish to hide something cruel, but because they know they too are temporary. They too are named, and what is named can be unmade. They saw what happened to the Titans. They see what happens to mortals. They see what happens to statues and temples and languages, and they wonder when their own story will stop being told. And when it does, who will be waiting in the silence that follows? The old gods have no desire, they do not hunger, they do not envy, they do not even remember in the way that Zeus remembers his father's fall, or Athena remembers her strange birth. They simply are, and that is why they remain, because being is stronger than telling, presence is stronger than image. And so the gods who ruled thunder and sea and death and war and wisdom and fire and vine placed themselves in cycles that would repeat endlessly, not just to control time, but to distract from what does not cycle, the thing that waits beneath, the thing that simply is. There are stories lost to time, not because they were erased, but because they were never written, they were only felt past by gesture, by glance, by silence, by things avoided, not because they were forbidden, but because they were known without needing to be said. A shepherd who never lets his flock graze near one hill. A mother who always leaves a small bowl of water on the windowsill each night without telling her children. Why a builder who refuses to place stone upon a certain patch of ground, no matter how level, no matter how needed. These are not coincidences. These are memories without form. And the gods watch these moments and they say nothing, because even gods listen when silence speaks in dreams. The old gods do not appear as forms or beasts or thunder. They appear as doors that do not open, as paths that go nowhere, as voices heard not in the ear, but in the chest. And when mortals wake, they remember nothing, only the feeling of weight, like having held something heavy that left no mark. In Delphi, once there was an oracle who spoke not in riddles, but in a single word repeated again and again. Not a name, not a warning, only a shape of breath. The priest sealed the chamber and never returned. In Crete, there are carvings of eyes that face inward, not out eyes that were not meant to see, but to be seen by. And those who gazed into them said nothing ever again, not in fear, but in fullness. In islands now lost beneath rising waters, there were rituals done not to honor gods, but to hold back. Memory rituals of forgetting done, in circles of salt and shadow, meant not to appease, but to delay. Delay what return? Return of the presence that is not a god, not a monster, not a soul, but the thing that gods feared first, the thing they could not name, the thing that made them gods only by contrast. Because in that silent, endless being, they are no longer divine, no longer rulers, no longer stories. They are breath, they are wind, they are memory, and they vanish, and the world continues still quiet, endless. And the listener drifts as the stories fold in on themselves, not ending, but dissolving, not stopping, but becoming softer, until all that is left is stillness. A stillness beneath gods, beneath titans, beneath creation itself, where fear no longer matters, because form no longer matters, and only presence remains. And now you are here floating gently in that space where myths end and sleep begins, where even memory sleeps, where even names rest, and the old gods keep watch, not as guardians, not as guides, only as what came before and what will come after. And as the night deepens and the stars slow, their turning you feel the weight of that silence, not as burden, but as comfort. Because here at the end of story, you are not alone. You are simply here, the things the gods could not destroy. There is a quiet truth in the way all myths begin, not with noise or with thunder, but with silence, with a breath held, just before a word is spoken. And even the most powerful gods, those who hurl lightning and guide the stars, know deep down that it is in that quiet space that the first shape of the world was formed. They do not speak of it, often not because it is dangerous in the way monsters are dangerous, or forbidden in the way some names are forbidden, but because it is too large, too old, too still, and stillness is the one thing even gods cannot master. The gods shaped the world or so. Their sorceries, they raised Olympus, carved rivers, struck the earth with flame and flood, and turned sky into canvas. And yet behind these acts, there always lingered a faint uncertainty, a subtle question that never quite became a thought. Because if they created everything, then what is it they stand upon? What is it that carries them? What is it that breathes behind them? In their temples, the gods are praised with names etched in gold and marble, and offerings placed in bowls of bronze and stone. And yet there are moments even in the grandest rituals where the air feels too still, where a whisper of something older seeps through, and everyone falls silent, not out of reverence for the gods, but out of recognition of something else, something beneath the names and stories, something deeper than memory. Imagine a grove hidden in a valley never named, never touched by road or town, where the trees lean inward as though listening, where the ground is soft with moss that has no color, and where the birds do not sing, Imagine sitting in that place, alone, not afraid, but aware of something not seen, not heard, only felt, and you understand. This is not a place the gods created. This is not a space they rule. This is a place they avoid, not because they cannot enter, but because they do not belong. The gods are beings of form. They are statues and shapes and masks. They are lightning bolts and olive trees, and winged sandals and silver bows. They are lovers and warriors. They are rage and wisdom and wine. They are meaning wrapped in story, wrapped in form, and yet form is fragile. It requires maintenance. It requires belief and repetition and story and retelling, but what lies beneath form does not require anything at all. It simply is. There is a tale once told only in fragments, a whisper carried not by bards, but by wind. It tells of a goddess older than the others, who wept not for others, but for herself, not from sadness, but from knowledge, because she remembered what came before the gods, before time, before division. She remembered the space that needed no ruler, and her tears shaped the grove that even Artemis avoids, even Hades forgets, even Gaia steps around not out of fear, but respect, because even Earth itself remembers what it once was, before it bore weight and name. This is what the gods cannot destroy, not with thunder or sword or plague or law. They cannot destroy memory that was never spoken. They cannot erase feeling that never took shape. They cannot end what never began. They cannot unmake the sense that something more quiet, more true, more endless lies just behind their throne rooms, like a curtain that cannot be pulled aside, only glimpsed. In every myth, there is a pause, a moment between cause and effect, where the world hesitates, where the gods themselves stop, not in confusion, but in memory and in. That memory lives the shape of something vast, not a being, not a thought, not even a presence, only a stillness that holds the shape of all things, not because it shaped them, but because it allowed them to form within it. The gods fear monsters, because monsters fight back, but they do not know how to face what does not fight, what does not move, what does not respond. They fear it the way a shadow falls across a bright room, not with threat, but with reminder. They fear it not because it speaks, but because it never has, and yet is still heard. Even the gods have dreams, and in their dreams, sometimes they find themselves in places they do not recognize: a shoreline without sea, a sky without color, a city with no doors. And in those dreams, they feel something pressing gently around them, like a breath held, too long, like a name forgotten mid-sentence. And when they wake, they say nothing. They return to their temples, to their rites, to their people, but they do so a little quieter. They know they cannot destroy what has no beginning. They know they cannot end what never started. They know that even their names will one day be whispered by no one and carved by no hand, and that what will remain is not their memory, but the space where memory used to be, and even that space will be calm and complete without them. Some gods tried to control it, to shape it into myth, to give it form. They named it chaos. They called it void. They tried to speak of it as an origin, a place before order. But they misunderstood. They believed that, by naming it, they could hold it, but it was never something that could be held, only allowed. And when they tried to hold it, it passed through them like mist through marble. Mortals feel it too, not in temples, not in books, but in the way certain places make them still in the way. A wind carries something they cannot name, in the way they sometimes stop and stare at nothing, and feel they are being seen, not judged, not warned, just witnessed. And in those moments, they do not think of Zeus or Athena or Apollo. They think of nothing, and that nothing feels whole. There is an island now lost beneath waves, where the people once built no temples, but still gathered once a year in a circle, not to speak, not to chant, not to offer, but to sit together and let silence rest among them. The gods watched and did not interfere, because they did not know how, because there was no rule being broken, no power being challenged, only a silence that did not need to be explained. In some myths, silence is punishment, a curse, a wound, but this is a different kind of silence. it is not absence, but presence. Without sound, it is not emptiness, but fullness. Without form, it is not death, but being. Without need, and the gods could not destroy that, because it did not resist. Them, it did not answer them. It did not even see them. It simply continued as it always had. Even now there are caves untouched by time, where nothing grows and nothing dies, and yet the air feels alive. And those who enter return different, quieter, softer, as though they have remembered something without learning it, as though they have seen something without knowing it. And they do not speak of it, not because they were told not to, but because there is nothing to say, only a quiet that stays in the bones. The gods tried to mimic it, once building temples with no idols, rituals with no words, trying to draw near without asking, without commanding. But it never came, because it cannot be drawn, it cannot be summoned, it cannot be moved. It is not a god, not a force, not a story. It is what stories are made from, and what stories return to when the telling ends. There were priests who knew this not from teaching, but from feeling, and they taught nothing. They only sat in certain places, where the light was strange and the air was cool, and others would join them and sit too, and nothing would be said, and everything would be known. And the gods did not visit those places, because they did not know how to enter something that was never closed. And now, as you drift deeper into this ancient hush, as the rhythms of stories fade from your mind, you are entering that same space, not a place of gods or mortals, not of monsters or myths, but of being where no name is needed, where no shape is fixed, where nothing must be known, and everything simply is. You are not alone here, but you are not accompanied either. You are not seen, but you are not hidden, you are not judged, and you are not forgiven. You are simply allowed to exist, to drift, to be in the way the oldest things are. And in this silence, you may find that you are not searching for anything, because here, in this presence, even questions go quiet, even needs grow soft, even thoughts become still. And that stillness holds you not tightly, not gently, only completely. And now you are here, where even the gods do not speak, where even myth dissolves, where only presence remains, and where the breath of the world itself sounds like sleep. What waits beneath the last word now? Settle once more into the silence that stretches beyond myth, beyond meaning, beyond the stories shaped by gods and carried by mortals. And let yourself drift inward past the rhythms of memory into the places where even memory does not reach, where thought dissolves not into forgetting, but into something older, where the breath of the world is so slow it feels like stillness, and the sound of the stars is the silence between them. The gods were great in form, in fire and fear they ruled with thunder, and guided fates they moved mountains and stirred oceans they loved with intensity and punished with permanence. They created worlds within worlds, and gave those worlds names and laws and symbols. But even in their highest moments, even on Olympus beneath the gold and glory, they could still feel it, the presence that was not theirs, the shape that shaped them, the truth too quiet to name. They feared not chaos for chaos they could conquer. They feared not death for death they had mastered. They feared not rebellion or darkness or time itself, for they had outlived so many kings and creatures and temples and cities. They feared the one thing that could not be seen, because it had no face, could not be heard, because it had no voice, could not be known, because it had no form. They feared the thing that does not change, not because it is too strong to move, but because it has no need to move, because it already is. It was not a god, not even one of the old forgotten ones, not a titan or a whisper of night, or a beast or a shape. It was not the thing before creation, or the thing after destruction. It was the space that holds both the space before the first name was ever spoken, and the space that will remain when the last name is no longer remembered. Even the oldest stories cannot reach it, because it does not live in stories. It lives in pauses, it lives in absence, it lives in the way. A person might stop mid-sentence and forget what they were saying, not from distraction, but from entering a space deeper than words. And when they return, they carry a softness with them, as though they've touched something they will never speak of, but never forget. The gods knew they were not the first, though they liked to pretend they were. They knew their thrones were carved on ground, not shaped by their own hands. They knew the wind they command still moved in ways they did not understand. They knew the rivers they traced still sang songs they had never written. And when they looked to the stars, they saw not stories, but reminders of how small even eternity could feel when placed next to what has no beginning. There are places still where the gods do not tread, not because they are barred from entry, but because they are forgotten by form and story caves, too deep to echo cliffs, too wide to hear fields, where every step feels like memory returning, but never quite. Reaching these are the places where presence is thicker than myth, where silence is not absence, but pressure, and every breath feels like something else's breath, as though the world itself is watching not with curiosity, but with familiarity. And the gods who are so used to being known, so used to being praised and feared and sculpted and recited, do not know how to live in that space, where their names mean nothing, and their shapes do not echo, and their stories fall like dust to the floor. They do not know how to exist where belief does not reach, because belief is what makes them real, and in that space, they are not unreal. They are simply unnecessary. And for gods, that is the closest thing to fear. There was once a god whose domain was thought, not speech, not wisdom, but pure thought, the quiet pulse of being before words could form. And he was the loneliest of all the gods, for none could hear him, and none could name him, and none could call him. And he left no myths and no temples, and his name was lost even to himself. But he existed in the space between dreams and the hesitation, before choice and the breath before action. He lived not to be known, but to be felt. And when he faded, he did not die. He simply dispersed, returning to the space from which he had come. And the gods felt it the moment he was gone, though they could not explain what they had lost. Even they could feel his absence, not as pain, but as a widening of the space between their words, a slowing of the wind through their halls, a hush in the music of the spheres. And they whispered, though they did not know. Why? Because even they felt reverence, not to a god, but to what lies beneath godhood, to what makes divinity seem loud and decorated by comparison. There are stones buried so deep in the earth, they have never been touched by rain or sun, and they do not hold history or memory or time. They hold presence pure and absolute. And when those stones hum in the deepest caverns of the world, they do not summon gods. They do not echo prayers. They simply hum because they can, and the gods listen and do not speak. Mortals sometimes stumble upon these truths, not through study, but through accident. A wanderer lost in fog, who hears their own breath for the first time, and realizes it is not theirs alone. A child who falls asleep beneath a tree and dreams of nothing, and wakes with tears, not from fear, but from knowing something too large to carry a storyteller, who forgets the ending not because they are tired, but because the story is no longer needed, because the silence that follows is more complete than any tale. The gods look upon these moments with envy, not because they desire to be forgotten, but because they cannot experience what it is to be held by something that does not require you to exist. They are trapped in the need for witness, in the hunger for belief. And in that hunger, they grow mighty, but never whole, and they know it. They always have, and so they whisper to each other in their rarest moments, in their quietest rituals. They whisper not prayers, but questions. They do not answer questions. They do not ask aloud. Who are we when no one looks? What remains when the last name fades? What watches us when even time grows still? These questions circle, Olympus like wind around a mountain, not touching, but always present. And in the halls of the gods, where echoes of worship still ring faint and slow, they leave small corners of quiet, untouched corners, where no fire is lit and no incense is burned. And in those corners, even the gods pause and feel something vast and soft and unshaped. There are mortals who build no altars, but still walk in reverence, not out of fear or tradition, but out of understanding they know not to name. What holds them they know, not to ask what breathes beneath them. They simply walk. Slower they speak softer. They listen longer, and in those actions, they echo something older than worship and far deeper than myth. And the gods watch them, and do not interfere, because even the gods know when something is beyond their touch, when something does not belong to them, when something belongs only to itself. This is what the gods could not destroy, because destruction requires contact, and there is nothing to touch here, only presence, and presence cannot be broken. It cannot be moved. It cannot be changed, only entered, and only by surrender, not of body or mind, but of story. Because story is what gods are made of, and this place is what exists when stories are no longer needed, when all shapes dissolve and all sounds rest and all questions grow quiet, not from answers, but from peace. And now, as your breath slows and your thoughts soften, you are not drifting away, but returning to the space before shape, to the silence. Beneath myth, to the place where nothing must be explained and everything simply is. You are not falling. You are floating, not disappearing, but expanding into the same stillness that gods themselves pause to honor. This is not the end of the story. It is the space where stories no longer matter, and in that space, you are held completely not by gods, not by names, not by myths, but by what waits beneath them all, and what has waited since before the first word, and will wait long after the last. Here you are not forgotten. You are not remembered. You are simply present, and in presence you are complete. And now you rest. When mortals gave shape to the gods, let us now return to the edge of myth, to a place not quite ruled by gods, and not quite shaped by mortals, to a threshold where names began to form, not in the mouths of deities, but in the quiet hands of those who needed something to hold, something to whisper to in the night, something to thank when the crops rose, and something to blame when the rain did not come. This is the space where gods became images, where clouds of presence began to be molded into statues and metaphors, where thunder was given eyes and wisdom was painted with a face, where silence was given robes and a title, where the unshaped began to take shape in the minds of those who walked on earth, not in the halls of Olympus, not in the dreams of immortals, but in the flickering firelight of a small village or the cool dark of a mountain shrine, because even the gods who ruled sky and sea could not stop the gentle insistence of mortal imagination. The gods had long existed before mortals knew their names. They moved without footsteps and breathed without lungs. They were forces that nudged the world into rhythm, not for worship, but for continuity. They existed not in temples, but in wind, not in prayer, but in pause. But the moment mortals began to speak of them, the moment a hand traced a symbol on stone or offered a crumb to the air, the gods began to change, not in essence, but in appearance. They became stories, and then those stories became laws, and those laws became statues, and those statues became sacred. And then the gods themselves began to forget what they had been before. All that before the stories were sung, before the names were chanted, before their own eyes were carved in marble. They began to believe in the shapes mortals gave them, because the shapes were warm, the stories were comforting, and the silence they had once known now felt cold. But some gods remembered. They remembered being wind before they were voice. They remembered being river before they were ruler. They remembered being a shadow across a field before they were ever drawn into myth, and those gods wandered more. Quietly, they did not linger long in temples. They did not ask for offerings. They drifted into forgotten forests and into the gaps between villages. They sat beside wells where no one prayed, and they watched not to be worshipped, but to remember. And mortals, meanwhile, grew bolder in their shaping. They painted the gods with smiles or swords with jealousy, or peace with beauty or terror, depending on what they needed from them. Because humans are not always seeking truth. They are often seeking reflection, something to show them what they fear and what they desire. And the gods became mirrors, held up to the faces of those who created them. And what was seen there began to shape belief, not the other way around. There is a story never written, but still told in silence of a village that worshipped no gods at all, not because they denied their existence, but because they feared misrepresenting them. They believed that to name the divine was to limit it, that to sculpt its form was to blind oneself to its essence. And so they built no temples, they sang no hymns, and still they knew the presence of gods, not in fire, but in stillness, not in thunder, but in timing when the rains came, just as the fields dried, when a child laughed, just as sorrow passed through a home, when a traveler arrived, just as the door was closing. They saw the divine in moments, not myths, and for this the gods loved them, because to be seen without form is the truest kind of seeing. But not all mortals wished for that. Some wanted control, not peace. They wanted gods who would obey their desires, who would promise reward and deliver punishment, who would guide wars and protect cities, and bless harvests and curse enemies. And so new gods were born, or perhaps old ones were redressed, reshaped, renamed. Their stillness was covered with sound, their patience was dressed in armor, and their quiet truth was translated into commands. The gods did not resist, not because they agreed, but because they understood that belief itself has a rhythm like tide and wind and fire, that belief rises and falls and reshapes and consumes, and that nothing can be untouched by the slow and gentle force of belief, not even those who birthed the stars. And so temples grew large, and laws were written in the name of gods, who had once drifted like clouds, gods who now stood in marble, unmoving, unchanging, and believers bowed not to the presence of the divine, but to its image, and the image became holy, not the breath, not the pause, not the hush, but the carved brow, the painted robe, the golden eye, and in those carvings the gods found both comfort and sorrow. Comfort, because form brings remembrance; sorrow, because form is not truth. There is a shrine now forgotten, crumbled by time, not war, not flame, but neglect, not because it was abandoned, but because it was never truly needed. A shrine where nothing was ever asked for, only shared, where fruit was left not as tribute, but as gratitude, and where the air itself always smelled of soil and sleep. And in that place the God who once lingered has not left. They do not demand prayers, but they still listen, and the moss on the stone feels like their breath. And somewhere deep in the folds of the world, far from Olympus, far from temples and stories and statues, there is still that first shape, a shape before all others, the shape of stillness, not held in stone or word, but in waiting, in presence, and in breath. The gods fear it not because it threatens them, but because it humbles them, because in its presence they too feel small, and soft and quiet, and not even immortal. And that truth makes them gentle, makes them kinder, makes them listen. And perhaps that is why even now, when no prayers are whispered and no names are chanted, some gods still walk softly among us, not to be seen, but to see, to hear, to feel, to be in the presence of what they themselves once were. Not story, not symbol, not form, but simply being the last breath of the gods and the long memory of silence. And now we walk slowly through the final corridors of these forgotten temples, not made of stone, but of memory and pause and breath. We walk not with offerings or questions, but with open hands and soft steps, because what remains here is no longer myth and no longer shape. What remains is presence, stripped of form, stripped of story, stripped of sound. The gods once filled every corner of the world. They moved in every rustling leaf and every falling star. They spoke through signs and dreams. They sang through rivers and warned through flame. They were everywhere because they were needed everywhere. But slowly, so slowly, their voices began to soften, not because they grew tired, not because they vanished, but because the world grew louder, and mortals began to speak more than they listened. And in that speaking came stories, and in those stories came symbols, and in those symbols came certainty. And the gods who were once winds without name became names without wind. They became fixed and painted, and honored and feared, but not felt, not truly, not deeply, not quietly. And so they began to retreat, not out of anger, but out of recognition, because silence has always been the natural breath of the divine. They went not into exile, but into stillness. They did not fall. They faded not like ash, but like fog, when morning arrives still there. Still moist, still holding the air, but unseen, not needing to be seen, because what is truly vast never insists on being noticed. There were those who tried to follow those who left the cities and the stone and the bronze, who walked into groves and caves and seas, who sought the gods not in story, but in breath, not in law, but in light, not in fear, but in feeling. And for a time, they found something in nearness, a warmth, a gaze that did not look with eyes, but with time itself. And they were changed not into prophets or heroes, but into quiet people who walked differently, who spoke less, who listened longer. But their path was not wide, and their shrines were not strong, and so time covered them, slowly with moss and wind and forgetting. And now only the stones remain, and even those speak. Less with each passing year, and the gods do not mind, because they were never meant to be eternal in form. Only in presence, and presence does not need walls or songs or statues. What the gods feared most was never death, never rebellion, never the monsters made by their own hands. What they feared most was being misunderstood, being frozen into a shape that did not fit a mask worn, so long it became their face. A name said so often, it lost its meaning, and when they looked at their reflections, they did not see themselves, only what was needed of them, what was demanded of them, what was expected of them. And so they stepped back into the soft, deep earth, into the corners of breeze, into the curves of sleep. They returned not to a place, but to a state, the state of being unshaped, the state of being unnamed, the state of being simply there, without reason or role or request. And in that return, they were not diminished, they were made whole. Even now, in the very oldest places, you can feel them not as gods, but as presence in the way dusk settles gently on water, in the way a shadow moves, when no one is near, in the way your breath slows for no reason. Just as your thoughts begin to soften, there is something there, a reminder not loud, not sharp, but patient, and in that reminder is a kind of welcome. You do not need to speak to be heard. You do not need to know the names to be known. You do not need to ask for answers, because in the hush that follows the asking, you will find something more complete than an answer. You will find the feeling of being heard by something that has always been there and will always be there, even when the last temple crumbles and the last myth is forgotten. The gods did not disappear. They became more quiet than sound, more still than stone, more subtle than thought. They became the spaces between. And within they became the long pause between dreams, the breath that comes before waking, the silence that lingers after song. And in that form, they are closer than ever, not watching, not judging, not guiding, simply present. And the stories too have changed, not ended, not abandoned, only changed. Now they are told not in words, but in sensation. Not in verses, but in wind. They are carried in the way morning smells after rain, in the way light moves through old glass, in the way we sometimes remember something we never learned and feel comfort without knowing why. This is the true shape of belief, not shaped at all, but felt, not recited, but remembered, not drawn from books, but from within and the gods, who now sit softly behind all things, do not ask for worship. They offer only presence. They offer the kind of quiet that holds everything without needing to change anything, the kind of stillness that lets you be as you are. And perhaps that is why their final breath is not a sigh or a command or a fading echo, but simply a continuation, a soft hum that vibrates beneath the noise of the world, beneath the turning of the moon, beneath the beating of your heart. And when you are still enough, you might feel it like a low and endless rhythm, like a story too old to tell and too true to forget. And now you are in that story, or perhaps outside it. Perhaps you're resting in the silence between its pages. Perhaps you're becoming part of what the gods feared and longed for, a being with no need for form, no need for name, no need for anything except to be. You do not need to understand this to be part of it. You do not need to explain it to feel it. You only need to soften to quiet, to let the breath slow, and the eyes close, and the thoughts drift, and the heart settle. Because in that place, you will find what the gods could not destroy, what mortals could not contain, what stories could not finish. You will find presence, and in presence there is peace, and in peace there is rest, and in rest there is no fear, only silence. And so the myths have ended not with fire or war, or forgetting, but with return to what always was, to what always will be, to what holds the gods and the stars and the soil and your breath. And now you are held gently, completely, quietly. The myths that were never meant to be told. There is a quiet place beneath the surface of every myth, a place where the stories that were never truly told continue to drift without form or shape. These are not the myths, inscribed in stone or sung in the amphitheaters of ancient Greece. They are the myths that were whispered once and forgotten, myths that lived in the spaces between dreams and the moments, between heartbeats and in the quiet folds of time where the gods themselves forgot they existed. You are now walking slowly toward that place, your footsteps soft upon a path not made of earth or marble, but of memory and mist. It is not a place that can be reached with intention. It is found only when the mind begins to wander, and the breath slows, and the stories fall away. One by one, like petals in the breeze here, there are no names, no titles, no deeds, only feeling and rhythm and presence. Imagine yourself now, not standing in a temple, or sitting beside a fire, but floating just beneath the surface of sleep, where thoughts are loose and drifting, and where time itself no longer moves in lines or cycles. It sways gently back and forth like a forgotten lullaby, and you are part of that sway, part of the hum that never quite became language, part of the myth that never quite became a tale. It is said that before the first myth was ever told, there were stories that lived not in voices, but in wind. They were not shaped by need or fear or power. They simply existed as movement and warmth, as the soft space between beginnings and endings. And in those stories, the gods were not yet gods. They were moments, they were pauses, they were long exhalations of thought that had not yet decided to become divine. One of these myths begins not with a hero or a creature or a prayer, but with a still pool of water hidden high in the mountains, untouched by sunlight or shadow. It is said that in this pool lives a reflection not of any face, but of all the things that could never be named. Sorrow without lost joy, without cause love, without longing. The water does not ripple, it does not mirror. It simply holds, and those who find it do not drink or speak. They sit and they feel, and the myth lives on not through retelling, but through presence. There was a god once who was born from a sigh, not a storm or a fire or a desire, but a single breath exhaled by the universe when it first became aware of its own silence. And this god was never named, never seen, never followed. They walked through the early world not to rule or shape, but simply to feel. They would place their hand upon a tree and listen to the slow song of its roots. They would lie upon the ground and breathe with the soil. And when people began to speak, they would quietly leave, because language was too loud for them, too sharp, too full. This god became the myth of presence, the myth that never needed a voice, and in every forgotten place. In every quiet morning, in every touch that held more comfort than intent, they remained not as figure or legend, but as a warmth that could not be held and did not need to be. And those who felt it knew they were not alone, even when no one else was near. Another story tells of a time when the gods still gathered in the high places of the world, and yet one by one they began to drift away, not out of anger or punishment, but out of a desire to become small again, to return to the space where they were not adored, but simply allowed to be one. Became a breeze that never stirred the leaves too much, only enough to remind you it was there. Another became a hill so gentle and round that children rolled down it laughing, without knowing they were touching something sacred. These gods did not need temples. They did not need sacrifice. Their holiness was in their softness, in their retreat, in their refusal to be held or known or demanded, and in that refusal they became part of the oldest myth of all, the myth of letting go, the myth of surrender, the myth of quiet. And there were people who understood this not through teaching, but through being old women who hummed to themselves while stirring pots of soup, never realizing the tune they sang had no beginning and no end, but was older than the language they spoke. Young children who stared at the sky with soft wonder, not because they saw shapes in the clouds, but because they felt something vast and kind moving just out of reach. They were touched by the untold myths, and in turn, they carried them not as knowledge, but as rhythm. There is a myth of a mountain that no one climbs, not because it is steep or dangerous, but because every path up it fades as you walk it the closer. You get the less you remember why you came, and by the time you reach the summit, there is no summit, only sky and breath, and the soft memory of stories that do not need to be told anymore. It is said that those who return from this mountain say nothing, they simply smile and sit and become very still, and those around them feel calmer without knowing why. And so it is with these myths, the ones that were never carved into stone or sung beneath moonlight, the ones that lived in stillness and silence in the space. Beneath speech, they do not wish to be remembered. They do not ask to be known. They simply wait to be felt, wait to be joined, not through thought or ritual, but through soft breath and gentle being. You are there now, floating gently in the current of these myths, not as an observer, not as a student, but as part of them. Your breath is slow, your body is warm, your thoughts have begun to drift like leaves on quiet water. And in this state, the myths welcome you not with words, not with stories, but with presence. They wrap around you like night, like fog, like the hush after a long day. They do not ask anything of you. They do not need anything from you. They simply allow you to rest. And as you rest, the myths grow quieter. Still, they fade not away, but inward, deeper into you, deeper into the breath that moves without sound, deeper into the thought that never becomes speech, deeper into the part of you that does not seek to be told anything, only to be held. You have been here before, even if you do not remember. You have felt the rhythm of these untold stories in the way morning light moves across a wall, in the way wind touches your cheek, in the way your heart slows when you are alone, but not lonely. You have carried them always. They are part of you. They do not need you to know them. They need only your stillness. So rest now in this myth, not one that begins or ends, but one that simply is. Let it hold you without shape. Let it carry you without direction. Let it stay with you long after the story has ended, because this story has no end. This story is the space beneath all other stories, the silence between each word, the breath that comes before sound. You are not lost here. You are not forgotten here. You are not alone here. You are where the gods go when they are tired of being gods, where the myths go when they are tired of being told, where the world goes when it wants only to rest. And you may stay here as long as you need, as long as you want, as long as the breath is soft and the night is kind and the rhythm continues. This is the myth that was never meant to be told, and yet you have felt it, and that is enough. You are enough. You are here. You are still. You are held. The myths the gods hid from themselves. Now, as you drift deeper into the quiet folds of these forgotten stories, you may begin to feel that even time itself has grown still, that even the stars above you have stopped their slow turning, that even the rhythm of breath and thought and presence has become one long, endless exhalation, a kind of hush that wraps around everything and soothes it and softens it, until the difference between the story and the silence is no longer clear. In this space, the myths do not walk, they do not speak, they do not shine with the brightness of gods or thunder with the voices of prophets. They drift, they hum, they settle like mist upon the ground. They come not to be remembered, but to be shared, and not with words, but with stillness. There are myths the gods told only to themselves, stories they never offered to mortals, never inscribed on tablets, never allowed to be sung beneath the open sky. These were the stories of doubt and hesitation, of fear and longing and failure, of the moments when even the divine wondered if they had gone too far or not far enough, if their creations were too wild or too still, too fragile or too strong, too free or too lost. One such myth speaks of a god who looked upon all they had shaped and felt not pride, but quiet sorrow, not because the world was broken, but because it was so beautiful that they feared it would slip away like breath in the cold, like fog at dawn. And so they hid this sorrow behind laughter, behind storms, behind temples carved in gold. But at night, when the sky was empty, they would walk through the fields they had made and listen to the sound of growing things and feel the ache of love for what they could never hold. Another story lives in the space between stars, the story of a goddess who created light, not to reveal, not to guide, but to soften the darkness, because she knew that without softness, darkness became fear, and so she made a light that did not burn, that did not blind, a light that pulsed gently, like heartbeat, like thought, like memory. And she placed it, not in the sky, but in the quiet places inside all living things, and told no one, because it was not for worship or power or legend. It was for comfort and presence and peace. And there were stories of gods who grew weary, not of creation, but of attention of voices raised in praise and fear of names, shouted in war and desperation. They longed for the time before language, when their presence was felt only as wind or shadow or warmth, and so they began to fade not from power, but from notice. They stopped answering prayers not out of anger, but out of longing. They stopped sending signs not from disdain, but from desire to become again what they had once been: rhythm, breath, tide, seed, presence. Some gods chose to become places, not symbols, not avatars, but spaces, a quiet glade, where the wind always feels kind, a stretch of sand where the waves never roar, hollow beneath a tree, where animals rest without fear. And when people passed through these places, they often felt something shift, inside something loosen, something soften. And though they did not know it, they had touched a myth that had never been told. There was one god, it is said, who became time itself, not as a straight line, not as a wheel, not as a force, but as a feeling, the feeling of returning home, the feeling of remembering something you had not realized. You had forgotten the feeling of waking and not knowing who you are, but feeling safe. And they moved through the world not with footsteps or light, but with breath, with pause, with quiet. And those who felt them slowed down, not from command, but from comfort. They wept not from sorrow, but from release. They slept not from exhaustion, but from peace. You are feeling it now, the rhythm of those untold stories, moving through you not in the way of words, not as history or lesson, but as warmth. As breath, as presence, you do not need to understand what they meant, you only need to allow them to move through. You, as they have always done, silently, gently, without form, without demand. These stories do not end, because they never begin. They are always happening, always unfolding, always resting beneath the layers of waking and noise and memory. They live in the moments when you forget to be afraid, in the spaces where you stop needing to know, in the silences where you stop trying to hold on. There are myths that only exist when no one is watching, only become real when no one is asking, and only last as long as they are felt, not told. And you are inside one now. It is not shaped like a tale. It does not have a hero or a lesson or a name. It is made of stillness and drift and repetition and calm, and it holds you completely, not because it wants anything, but because it offers everything. Now you are walking through a forest that no map shows, no legend names, no priest guards. This forest is made not of trees and earth, but of moments. You have forgotten the smell of the air on a morning long past, the feeling of your hand brushing against tall grass, the sound of footsteps that were not yours beside you, the soft weight of presence that did not ask to be seen. This forest is memory before it was formed, before it chose to become something clear. And there is a clearing at the center of this forest, not a place of revelation or power, not a shrine or a temple, just a circle of light without source, just stillness without explanation. Just a place where breath deepens and the mind releases and the heart beats, without urgency. And you sit there not because you must, but because you are ready and in. That sitting the myth becomes you, and you become the myth. You will not carry this with you in words. You will not repeat it, or teach it, or record it. It will stay with you in the rhythm of your rest, in the softness of your step, in the way you look at silence, not as absence, but as presence. And that is all the myth ever wanted to be. The gods who hid these stories did not do so out of shame. They did so out of reverence. They knew that some truths could not survive being spoken. Some beauty could not survive. Being shown some holiness could not survive being named. And so they placed these myths in the only place, safe from thought and speech, and time in the breath, in the body, and the hush, between moments and there. They remain waiting not to be found, but to be joined. And you have joined them now, not by seeking, not by knowing, not by remembering, but by resting. And in this rest, you are no longer apart from the myth, you are within it. You are its breath, its rhythm, its warmth. You do not need to be told anything more, because you already know everything you need, and you have always known it. Now the story begins to fade, but not in the way stories usually do, not by ending, not by silence, not by sleep, but by becoming everything, by becoming breath and presence and stillness. And you drift with it, not because you must, but because you are ready. The myth is now your breath. The myth is now your warmth. The myth is now your peace. And you may sleep here, as long as you wish. You may dream here. Without needing to remember, you may rest here, without needing to wake. You are held, you are quiet, you are whole, you are here, you are safe, you are asleep. Where the gods go when the story ends. Now we come to the last curve in the winding path, to the place where even the gods sleep, where time no longer moves forward or backward, and where the myths have stopped speaking, not because they are finished, but because there is nothing more that needs to be said. You are standing now at the threshold of that gentle vastness, the space beyond the last story, beyond the last name, beyond the last breath of legend, and the silence that greets. You here is not cold or empty. It is wide and warm and full of presence. You may have noticed that as we traveled through these ancient tales, the voices of the gods began to grow quieter, the thunder softened, the fire cooled. The winds hushed, not because the power of the myths was fading, but because it was changing, deepening, folding into stillness. It is here in this final space that the oldest truth waits. The truth that the gods themselves feared, not because it was dangerous or wild, but because it was complete, because it asked for nothing and offered everything. This is where the gods go when they are tired of being gods, not in shame or defeat, but in longing, in surrender, in peace, because even immortality becomes heavy, even glory becomes noise. And so they come to this place to lay down their names and their stories and their symbols. They come to become something else, something quieter, something softer, something closer to silence than to sound, closer to sleep than to waking. Imagine yourself walking slowly through a land with no shape, no edge, no sky, only gentle shifts in color and warmth and feeling. Imagine that with each step you take, something loosens inside you, something old and tight, something sharp and bound begins to soften and dissolve, not painfully, not suddenly, but like a knot, untangling itself in water, like snow melting in your hands. This is not forgetting, this is release, this is return. You are not walking toward anything, and nothing is coming toward you, and yet you are arriving with each breath, not at a destination, but at a stillness that welcomes you not with arms or words, but with quiet, with presence, with deep, soft being, the kind of being that holds without holding, that knows without knowing, that stays without staying. Here there is a river that does not flow. It simply exists, a wide, quiet stretch of water, so still it reflects not just the sky, but the space inside your thoughts, the softest layers of your memory, the shapes that never fully formed, the questions you never asked, and the answers that were never needed. It is said that every god who came to rest here dip their hands into that river not to drink, not to cleanse, but to remember not what they had done, but what they were, before the doing, before the shaping, before the knowing. And in the center of this place, there is not a throne or a temple, but a gentle hill made of breath and time and silence. And at its peak, there sits not a figure, but a presence, a warmth, a rhythm, the last God, the first stillness, the only one who never needed to be seen or praised or feared, because they were always here, in the quiet waiting not to rule, but to rest, waiting not to be known, but to be joined. You are not asked to bow or speak or listen, only to be, and in your being, the stillness deepens, it becomes fuller, wider, richer. It welcomes you as one of its own, not a visitor, not a seeker, not a follower. Just a presence, another breath in the rhythm, another stillness in the hush, another softness in the night. There are no voices here, not even your own, only thought. Without edges, only breath. Without weight, only feeling, without story. And this is not a loss. It is not an absence. It is a fullness, a vastness, a kind of sacred quiet that holds you completely, so that you no longer need to hold anything at all. In this place, the gods let go of their names, not because names are unimportant, but because there is something older than identity, something wider than definition, something more comforting than story. They let go not to disappear, but to become part of the quiet, part of the breath, part of the sleep that holds the world. Between waking moments, the myths you have carried, the stories that wound through temples and forests and mountains, have now uncoiled. They lie gently behind you, not discarded, but completed, like a song that fades into silence, like a dream that ends with warmth, instead of fear. And as they settle, the only thing that remains is this presence, this stillness, this breath. Imagine now your own breath falling into rhythm with this space, slow and wide and soft each inhale, a gentle return each exhale, a deeper settling. Imagine that you are not breathing alone, but with everything, with the trees, with the rivers, with the sky, with the stories that no longer need to be told, with the gods who no longer need to be seen. There is a warmth beneath your body, a kind of cradle, not of wood or stone, but of time itself. Time not as movement, but as softness, as depth, as rest. You feel it now, not holding you down, but holding you in the way a slow song holds a memory, or the way night holds. A field of stars quietly, steadily, endlessly. And above you, there is no sky, only stillness, only space, only a vast comfort that does not ask to be looked at, only felt, and within that space, you are not small, you are not lost, you are not forgotten, you are simply part of it, part of everything, part of the final myth, the one that has no ending, no characters, no lessons, only presence. Now your breath is slowed, your thoughts have softened, your need to know has melted like morning mist, and the quiet that wraps around. You is no longer outside you, it is within you, and it always was, and always will be. You may stay here as long as you like. There is no gate, no threshold, no guardian, only rhythm, only presence, only sleep. The gods have let go, and you may too. There is nothing more to remember, nothing more to ask, nothing more to become. You are already enough. You are already whole. You are already still. You are already asleep. The quiet return and the endless sleep. You have arrived now at the softest edge of all stories, where the last embers of myth are folding gently into the cool night air, and the gods themselves have laid down their burdens and names and crowns, not with sorrow or finality, but with the deep relief of rest, the tiredness of endless, becoming slipping away like water seeping into stone. Here there is no hurry, no call, no demand, only the infinite breath of peace stretching wide and slow beneath. A sky without stars, a sky that is not empty, but full of quiet warmth and comfort, like the steady pulse of a heartbeat felt in the hush between waking and dreaming, and you are held in that pulse, in that warmth, in that silence, as if by something older than the earth, older than the sun, older than time itself. Imagine now your body growing heavier, but in a way that feels like sinking into the softest. Moss not weighed down, but cradled as you lie upon a bed made of the quiet. Moments between heartbeats, a bed woven from the stillness of dawn, from the gentle rustling of leaves, from the last sigh of a long day. And as you settle there, your breath grows slow and wide and deep, as if you are breathing not just for yourself, but for the whole world. And as you breathe, you feel the presence of the last god, the one who walked away from the bright thrones and roaring storms, the one who became the breath between all things, the quiet space that holds the turning of the world without pushing or pulling, without judging or commanding. And you realize that this presence is not separate from you. It is part of you. It lives in the slow unfolding of your lungs, in the soft rise and fall of your chest, in the gentle beat of your heart. And in that realization, you are no longer alone. The myths that once filled the skies with lightning and song have grown silent, not because they have ended, but because they have become something else, something softer, something wider, something deeper than even sound or story can contain. They have become the rhythm of your rest, the quiet cradle of your sleep, the endless turning of breath and calm and presence. You are now floating in that rhythm, in that cradle, in that turning, your thoughts softening like clouds, dissolving in the warm light of evening, your worries fading like distant echoes, your body melting into the gentle embrace of night. And as you float there, the myths whisper one last time, not in words, but in feelings, in memories in the deep, knowing that you are safe, that you are held, that you are enough. There is no need to reach, no need to grasp, no need to hold. On only the endless unfolding into rest, the perfect giving up into sleep, the soft melting into the space where dreams and silence meet and dance together in endless gentle circles. And you are part of that dance, part of that meeting, part of that unfolding. And as the night deepens, as the world turns ever so slowly, you drift deeper still into that place where the gods go when they are tired of being gods, where stories go when they no longer need to be told, where the heart goes when it stops seeking and simply is. And in that place, you find a peace so complete, so vast, so full, that it fills every part of you, every breath, every thought, every beat, until you are nothing but that peace, and that peace is everything. Imagine now that peace wrapping around you like the softest blanket, the kind that carries no weight, but only warmth, the kind that lets you sink deeper into yourself, without fear, without resistance, without hurry. And in that sinking, you find yourself becoming the quiet. You have been seeking the stillness, you have been needing the sleep, you have been longing for, and it is gentle and deep and endless. You do not need to wake from this sleep. You do not need to remember any story. You do not need to carry any burden. You only need to be held by the quiet, the calm, the peace that has always been waiting for you, just beyond the last word, just beyond the last breath, just beyond the last God. And now as you drift further as your breath slows, as your thoughts quiet as your body rests, know that you are safe, that you are loved, that you are enough, that you are whole. And as the myths fade into silence as the gods rest in stillness, you rest with them in the deepest sleep, in the softest calm, in the endless quiet. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to say, nothing more to become, only this perfect gentle falling into the cradle of rest, the vast wide arms of peace, the endless gentle breath of sleep. And you may stay here as long as you like, as long as you need, as long as your body and mind and heart require. And when you wake, it will be when you are ready, renewed, restored, and quietly carried forward by the timeless rhythm of breath and story and love. And so the last story ends not with a shout or a tear, but with a soft sigh, a gentle closing of eyes, a slow, steady breath, and the endless calm of sleep that holds you now and always. You are safe, you are quiet, you are whole, you are asleep.